Richard Gere had always taken pride in being a devoted husband. He wasn't the most romantic, nor was he perfect, but he had consistently supported his wife, Sandra Bullock. For 3 decades, they had weathered life's challenges together, raising 2 daughters who were now married, purchasing a home, and managing the everyday pressures of work and family life. Their relationship had seen its fair share of quarrels and disputes, but Richard was convinced their connection was firm, unyielding. He had centered his life around this conviction. However, lately Richard had noticed subtle changes in Sandra's demeanor. It began with small signs, like her distractedness at dinner or the absent-minded smiles she gave her phone while typing messages with a vigor and enthusiasm that left Richard feeling strangely left out. She started going out more often, claiming she was meeting friends he had never met. The gym became her new fixation, a place she now frequented nearly every day. Richard tried to dismiss the growing discomfort in his gut, attributing it to the drudgery of a long-term marriage. Yet, he couldn't dismiss the sense that something was amiss. One evening, Richard found himself alone in the living room, the soft buzz of the television the sole noise in the house. It was a typical scene him on the sofa, awaiting Sandra's return from one of her late nights out. But that night, the absence of her presence felt more oppressive. As the clock struck past midnight and Sandra had not yet returned, Richard's patience thinned. He glanced at the mantelpiece, where a family photograph from a beach holiday years earlier displayed them all smiling under the sun. He observed his own smile in the image, the way he had embraced Sandra and their daughters, and experienced a twinge of something, perhaps nostalgia, or maybe a profound, indescribable sadness. The joy in that photo seemed like an artifact of a bygone era, one that was gradually slipping from his grasp with each day. When Sandra eventually entered, it was well after 1 in the morning. She was dressed strikingly, in heels and a sleek black dress that accentuated her figure, her hair impeccably styled. A strange cologne, not his own, mingled with her perfume, striking Richard with the force of a physical blow. His heart sank, a cold fear settling in his stomach. "Hey," he attempted to say evenly, but his voice cracked, emerging as a rasp. Sandra barely looked at him, her eyes weary yet distant. She uttered a brief "hi" as she removed her shoes and swiftly headed to the bedroom, her pace quick as though eager to create distance between them. There was no kiss, no tender gesture, not even a proper goodnight, just the sterile, routine actions of a woman mechanically doing what was necessary before retreating to the refuge of their bed, or rather, her bed, as it hadn't felt like theirs in months. Richard sat frozen, watching her disappear. His mind was a whirlwind of thoughts, none coherent. Where had she been? Who was she with? Had she spent the evening dancing, drinking, possibly flirting with someone else? These questions swirled in his mind, yet he found himself unable to speak them. Instead, he remained in the quiet, his fingers clenched around the armrest of the sofa so tightly his knuckles whitened. He knew he should confront her, seek answers, but part of him was crippled by the fear of what he might learn, the fear of breaking the delicate illusion that had sustained him. Thus he said nothing, letting the silence expand between them like a dense, suffocating fog. As Sandra shut the bedroom door behind her, a profound, gnawing emptiness took root in Richard's chest, a void he had no idea how to fill. It was the first time in his life that he felt completely alone, even with her only a few steps away. The following weeks became a suffocating haze of tension and discomfort for Richard. The increasing gap between him and Sandra gnawed at him constantly. Their talks, once warm and effortless, had turned forced and uncomfortable, as if they were strangers making clumsy small talk. Sandra's new routine only heightened his suspicion. She was away more often than not, always leaving with some vague reason. One evening, as Sandra got ready for another late-night gym session, Richard's anxiety hit its peak. He observed her getting dressed, noting the careful attention she paid to her appearance, her hair flawlessly styled, her makeup flawlessly done. It wasn't the attire one would typically wear to the gym. His stomach twisted with apprehension, and when she gave him a goodbye kiss, it felt like the faint touch of a ghost, merely a formality. As soon as the door shut behind her, Richard made up his mind. He couldn't continue living in this agony, always wondering what was happening when he wasn't looking. He grabbed his car keys and left the house, resolved to follow her and uncover the truth. He discreetly followed Sandra's car, maintaining a distance that ensured she wouldn't spot him. His heart thudded loudly, each turn tightening the knot in his stomach. The drive felt endless, but eventually Sandra's car pulled into a gym parking lot across town. Richard parked a block away, far enough to stay unnoticed but close enough to watch the entrance. He waited, the minutes stretching into hours. His mind conjured various damning scenarios. He fixed his gaze on the gym's entrance, hoping against hope that she would exit alone, although deep down he feared the worst. When the door finally opened, and Sandra appeared not alone but laughing and linked arm in arm with a man who seemed to be in his late 20s, Richard's heart sank. His casual demeanor infuriated Richard even more as they walked to a nearby bar, their bodies unsettlingly close. Richard watched them from his car, his hands white-knuckled on the steering wheel, overwhelmed by a building rage. They entered the bar and seemed completely absorbed in each other, sharing drinks and laughter that echoed through the glass, their faces alight with joy, a joy that pierced Richard's heart like a knife. Each touch, each smile felt like a personal betrayal. He watched, unable to look away, as the man whispered something that made Sandra laugh and playfully swat at him. The sight was excruciating, yet Richard found himself rooted to the spot. When they eventually left the bar well after midnight, Richard trailed them, each step fueling his growing fury. They didn't return to the gym or go their separate ways as he had hoped. Instead, they walked towards a nearby hotel, their hands entwined in a carefree manner. Richard parked a few blocks away, his breathing harsh and rapid as he watched them enter the hotel together. The sight of them vanishing into the lobby was the last straw, breaking the final thread of his restraint. The rage within him solidified into a chilling resolve. This was more than just a betrayal, it was a calculated, heartless act, and he couldn't let it pass unchallenged. As he sat in his car observing the hotel entrance, Richard felt a dark, unyielding force envelop him. He understood the steps he had to take. That night, peace was unattainable for Richard. Sleep evaded him as he lay in bed, gazing at the ceiling, his mind inundated with visions of Sandra and the younger man. The betrayal deeply wounded him, an injury that grew more painful with each moment. His thoughts plummeted into a bleak abyss, oscillating between the agony of her unfaithfulness and a mounting urge for retribution. As the night dragged on, every tick of the clock intensified his inner turmoil, leaving him restless and seething by dawn. Having resolved his course of action, Richard was ready to confront her by morning, eager to demand the truth and compel her to acknowledge the repercussions of her deeds. That morning, Richard was like a storm on the verge of erupting. He could scarcely bear to look at Sandra as she moved around the kitchen, humming nonchalantly as if nothing was amiss. Her demeanor, so unaffected by the guilt that was ravaging him, only inflamed his wrath further. When she finally sat down with her cup of coffee, Richard couldn't contain himself any longer. Who was he? He murmured, his voice low but filled with vehement anger. Startled by the intensity in his tone, Sandra looked up. Who was who she feigned ignorance? The young man you were with last night, Richard pressed, his gaze fixed on hers, the one you were holding hands with, laughing with. Don't act oblivious, Sandra. I followed you. Sandra's expression momentarily showed a trace of panic, but she swiftly masked it with indifference. Taking a slow sip of her coffee, she replied with a sigh, Richard, it's not what you think. Her voice was patronizing, as if she were addressing a naive child. It was just a bit of fun. Nothing serious fun. Richard's voice trembled with barely contained fury. You think sneaking around behind my back with some guy half your age is fun? Do you even grasp what you're saying? Sandra rolled her eyes and leaned back, exasperated. Richard, don't be so dramatic. We've been married for 30 years. People evolve. I've evolved. You can't seriously expect me to remain the same. Richard's heart pounded vehemently, each throb resonating like a drum. So, you're just going to discard everything we've built because you're bored? Because you need some excitement? Sandra's response was dismissive, as if the conversation was trivial. I'm just enjoying life. Maybe you should try it sometime. Enjoying yourself, Richard echoed, the words tasting bitter. By betraying me? By tearing our family apart? What about our daughters, Sandra? What about the life we've built together? Sandra shrugged, her gesture nonchalant yet callous, igniting another surge of rage in Richard. They're grown, Richard. They'll understand. Besides, we both know this marriage hasn't been right for a long time. Maybe it's time we both moved on. The phrase struck Richard like a physical blow. The indifference with which she disregarded their shared life was astonishing, a betrayal not just of their marriage but of all they had together. Is that it then? Richard asked, his voice hollow, masking the sheer pain he felt. You're just going to walk away from 30 years, as if it's trivial, As if I'm trivial, don't be so melodramatic, Richard, Sandra retorted, waving her hand dismissively. It's just a bit of fun, it doesn't have to mean anything, she had said. But for Richard it meant everything. In that instant, something inside him broke, the remnants of his affection for her disintegrated. He had devoted years to building a life with her, sacrificing, compromising, and believing in their shared future. And now, she dismissed it all as trivial, a mere phase she was eager to cast aside. The anger that had been simmering inside him erupted, turning icy, solidifying into an unforgiving resolve. Sandra had made her decision, and now Richard would make his. The next evening, Richard found himself in a place he never thought he'd revisit, standing outside the same dimly lit bar where he had first uncovered the truth about Sandra and her young lover. The neon sign above flickered, casting a stark, unforgiving light over the entrance. He stayed hidden in the shadows, his heart tumultuous with mixed emotions, his mind incessantly replaying the previous night's betrayal. Inside, the bar buzzed with the usual sounds of laughter and chatter, but to Richard, it was merely background noise against the grim scenario unfolding in his life. He watched as Sandra and the younger man entered, their bodies close, their laughter mingling with the din. They were utterly blatant, carefree, as if oblivious to the rest of the world. It was evident now that they weren't even attempting to conceal their relationship. The secrecy was gone, replaced by bold, unashamed displays of affection that made Richard's skin crawl. From his shadowed vantage point, his gaze never left them as they settled into the same booth they had occupied the night before. They ordered drinks and engaged in lively conversation, their interaction marked by smiles and touches that once were exclusively his. Each gesture, each chuckle, twisted the knife deeper into his gut. The bar's dim lighting did nothing to obscure the palpable connection between them, the way they leaned in close, the way Sandra's hand rested on the man's arm, the way she looked at him with a warmth and affection that had long vanished from her interactions with Richard. As the minutes painfully dragged on, each moment pushed Richard closer to the brink. His thoughts swirled chaotically with anger, pain, and a darkening resolve. He couldn't tear his gaze away, even though every instinct screamed at him to leave, to walk away and never return. But he remained stationary, his body tense, coiled tightly like a spring ready to snap. When they eventually left the bar, Richard followed discreetly, his heart pounding, his breathing quick and uneven. They were too engrossed in each other to notice the figure shadowing them through the quiet streets. He trailed them as they meandered, laughing and conversing until they reached a secluded park. The night air was cool, tinged with the scent of grass and the distant chirping of crickets. The park was deserted, setting the stage for what felt like the final act of their deceit. The younger man wrapped his arms around Sandra, pulling her close. Their silhouettes merged in the dim light. Richard's heart stopped as the man's smug, careless voice carried through the night. "She's mine for tonight, old man. We're going to have a wild time until we're satisfied." Sandra's laughter followed, light yet cruel. She turned, her gaze catching Richard's, her eyes shining with mockery and detachment. She walked towards him, her steps slow, deliberate. When she reached him, she placed her hand on his shoulder, a gesture that felt more like a push into the abyss. "Don't worry, darling," she said with a smirk, her voice oozing condescension. "I'll be back when I'm done then." Turning away, she laughed as she walked back to her companion. As she rejoined her lover, leaving Richard standing there immobilized by the harsh realization that there was no turning back, they walked away, vanishing into the shadows. Richard felt something inside him fracture, a final break that plunged him into a state where forgiveness had no place, only a fierce, unyielding yearning for vengeance. In the following days, Richard was enveloped in a fog, his mind stuck in an endless loop of pain and anger, replaying the betrayal repeatedly. The image of Sandra laughing, her hand on the younger man's arm, haunted him both day and night. The burden of her mockery, the way she had trivialized their life together as if it were just a minor annoyance, was too much for him to endure. He felt emptied out, every emotion drained from him except for one, a searing desire to make them suffer. He tried to continue with his daily life, but everything seemed pointless. Food lost its flavor, sleep was fleeting, and work was merely a sequence of actions he performed, detached and emotionless. His colleagues noticed his transformation, the dark circles under his eyes, his distracted demeanor, but no one dared to inquire. Richard was a man coming undone, and it was evident to anyone who observed him. During one of those sleepless nights, as he lay staring at the ceiling, an idea began to form in his mind. Initially, it was just a brief, shocking thought, but as the days passed, that thought expanded, took shape, and hardened into something cold and deliberate. If Sandra believed she could discard their life together, mock him, and move on without repercussions, she was profoundly mistaken. Richard began to plan, his mind operating with a precision that even he found surprising. He started by observing them closely, tracking their movements. He learned their routine, where they went, when they met, how long they stayed together. He noted the days they were most likely to meet, the places they frequented, and their habitual patterns. His obsession grew, fueled by the anger simmering just below the surface. However, watching wasn't sufficient. Richard needed more. He needed to ensure that when the moment arrived, there would be no errors. So he did something he never thought he would. He purchased a gun. The process was simpler than he anticipated. The exchange of money for the cold, heavy metal felt unreal, like a scene from a film. But this wasn't a movie, this was his life, his shattered reality, and now this gun was a part of it. He practiced with it, feeling its weight, the power it symbolized. Each shot he fired at the range was a release of the fury that had been building inside him, each bullet a commitment to the revenge he was about to exact. He kept the gun concealed, a dark secret known only to him, waiting for the right moment to use it. That moment came sooner than expected. The night was crisp, the air tinged with the onset of autumn. Richard had followed them once again, but this time with no hesitation, no uncertainty. His heart pounded, not with fear, but with a grim resolve that chilled him to the core. They were laughing, holding hands, oblivious to the world, as they headed to the same hotel they had visited before, a place that had become their sanctuary for deceit. Richard watched them from the shadows, his hand resting on the gun concealed beneath his coat. He waited until they disappeared inside, then approached. Each step brought him closer to the confrontation he had meticulously planned. As he entered the hotel, the front desk clerk barely noticed him, too engrossed in their work to see the ominous expression on Richard's face. He moved through the lobby with a singular focus, scanning the hallways until he found the room number he had memorized. The door was slightly ajar, their voices muffled but clear. Richard's breathing became shallow and rapid as he stood before the hotel room door, his fingers white from gripping the gun concealed beneath his coat. Every step that had led him here replayed in his mind like a relentless nightmare. He couldn't escape the betrayal, the lies, the mockery, all of it. It culminated in this moment. He had crossed a line within himself, one that he knew could never be uncrossed. There was no turning back. He could hear them inside, their voices muffled but clear, laughing, oblivious to the storm about to break over them. The sound of Sandra's laughter, so carefree and vibrant, cut through him like a blade. But that laughter, which had once been his solace, his joy, was now the ultimate mockery. Richard raised his hand and knocked on the door. The sound echoed in the hallway, a hollow, ominous thud that seemed to reverberate through his entire being. His heart pounded so fiercely he thought it might burst. Every second felt like an eternity as he waited, his mind racing with thoughts of what was about to unfold. This was it, the point of no return. The door swung open, and there he was, the younger man, standing in the doorway, his face a mix of surprise and confusion. For a split second their eyes met, and Richard saw the realization dawn in the man's gaze, just before Richard shoved his way into the room. The younger man stumbled backward. But Richard was relentless, his hand already pulling the gun from his coat. Sandra was sitting on the bed, her back to the door, but when she heard the commotion she turned. Her eyes went wide as she saw Richard standing there, the gun aimed at them. Her scream pierced the air, a sound of pure terror that seemed to freeze time itself. "Richard, what the hell are you doing?" she shrieked, her voice trembling with fear. Richard's grip on the gun tightened, his knuckles turning white. "You think you can just walk all over me?" he snarled, his voice cold and unfamiliar to his own ears. "You think you can laugh in my face and get away with it?" The younger man took a hesitant step forward, as if trying to defuse the situation, but Richard quickly pointed the gun at him, freezing him in place. "Stay right there," Richard hissed, his eyes burning with a fury that made the younger man falter. Sandra scrambled off the bed, her face contorted with fear and desperation. "Richard, please," she begged, her voice cracking. "Let's just talk about this. We can work something out." Richard laughed, a bitter, hollow sound that filled the room with a sense of impending doom. "Work something out? There's nothing to work out. You've already made your choice. The younger man, his hands raised in a pleading gesture, tried to speak, his voice calm but laced with fear. Look, man, we didn't mean any harm. Let's just cool down and... Shut up, Richard roared, his finger trembling on the trigger. His mind was a whirl of pain and anger, and the gun in his hand felt like the only anchor he had left. You took everything from me. Now it's your turn to lose. Without warning, Richard pulled the trigger. The sound of the gunshot was deafening, a thunderous crack that echoed off the walls of the small hotel room. The younger man's body jerked as the bullet tore through him, and then he collapsed to the floor, his blood spreading in a dark pool beneath him. The room seemed to tilt, the world narrowing to the sight of the man's lifeless body lying at Richard's feet. Sandra's scream shattered the silence, raw and filled with horror. She rushed to the younger man's side, her hands frantically pressing against the wound, but it was futile. The life was already draining from his eyes. She looked up at Richard, her face streaked with tears, her hands covered in blood. "Richard, please," she sobbed, her voice trembling. "Don't do this." "I'm sorry. I was wrong. We can fix this." But Richard was beyond reason, beyond anything except the cold, unyielding need for retribution. He had come too far, crossed too many lines to stop now. The weight of everything he had lost pressed down on him, suffocating, relentless. He raised the gun again, his hands steady this time. "You destroyed our family," he said quietly, his voice devoid of emotion. "Now you get to live with the consequences," Richard declared as Sandra's eyes widened in terror, her pleas escalating to desperate cries. But it was too late. Richard's finger tightened on the trigger, and the gun roared again. The sound was final. An echo of the life that had once been theirs, now shattered beyond repair. Sandra slumped to the floor, her body falling beside her lover's, the two of them lying together in death as they had in life. The room fell into a profound silence, the weight of what had just occurred settling over Richard like a suffocating blanket. He stared at the scene before him, his mind numb, unable to fully comprehend the reality of what he had done. He had taken everything from them, just as they had from him, and now there was nothing left. Richard stood in the hotel room, gazing at the lifeless bodies on the floor. The burden of his actions weighed heavily on him, like a fog that refused to lift. The room, which had been filled with tension and chaos just moments before, was now eerily quiet, the only sound being the slow, rhythmic drip of blood pooling on the floor. The silence felt oppressive, bearing down on him with almost physical force. For a moment, Richard couldn't move, his mind numb, struggling to process the finality of his actions. But even through the haze of shock, one thought cut through clearly: he couldn't stay here. The police would arrive soon, and when they did, there would be no escape. The weight of his crime would come crashing down on him, and there would be no way to explain or justify the bloodshed. Richard snapped into action, his movements mechanical and detached. He pulled a handkerchief from his pocket and carefully wiped the gun clean, erasing any trace of his fingerprints. He placed the weapon on the floor next to the bodies, a parting gesture that seemed both final and hollow. His heart pounding in his chest, each beat a harsh reminder of the ticking clock, Richard knew he had to leave now. Without looking back, he turned and walked out of the room, closing the door behind him with a soft click that seemed to echo in the hallway. He moved quickly, his mind racing as he navigated the hotel corridors. The adrenaline surging through his veins sharpened his senses, making every sound, every movement feel amplified. But as he stepped into the lobby, he forced himself to slow down, to blend in. He couldn't afford to draw attention. The hotel staff and guests were oblivious to the horrors that had just unfolded upstairs. Richard walked through the lobby, his face a mask of calm, his steps deliberate. He exited the hotel and headed straight for his car parked a few blocks away. His heart was still racing, but his mind was already shifting to the next phase of his plan. He drove aimlessly for hours, the city lights blurring into a kaleidoscope of colors as he sped through the streets. His thoughts were a chaotic jumble of fear, regret, and grim determination. He knew he couldn't go home, not to a house filled with memories now tainted by betrayal and blood. There was nothing left for him there, only the wreckage of a life that had been shattered beyond repair. There was only one option: he had to disappear. Richard drove to a remote area on the outskirts of the city, a place where the dense woods swallowed the roads and the silence was absolute. He parked the car and began walking, each step taking him further from the life he had known. This was part of the plan he had prepared for, a contingency he had never imagined he would need but had set in place just in case. The secret bank account, the fake passport, it was all coming into play now, his only lifeline. As he reached the edge of the woods, Richard glanced back at the road, a final farewell to the world he had left behind. He was leaving behind his old life, making his way to the nearest airport with movements swift and practiced, as if on autopilot. The fake passport in his hand felt alien, a stark reminder of the new life he was about to enter, a life that would be defined by evasion, by hiding, by the knowledge of what he had done. He purchased a one-way ticket to a distant country, a place where he knew he could disappear, leaving everything behind. As the plane taxied down the runway and lifted into the sky, Richard looked out the window, watching the city fade into the distance. The enormity of his actions finally began to weigh heavily on him, an inescapable burden, but there was no turning back now. He had made his choice and he would live with it, far from the life he once knew, from the man he once was. Richard settled into his new life, meticulously constructed, far from the remnants of his past. He had taken great care to erase any trace of the man he once was. His appearance was altered, his hair now a different shade, cut shorter, and his face clean-shaven, devoid of the familiar beard that had once been part of his identity. He adopted a new name, a new backstory, and settled in a small town nestled in the mountains of South America, a place so remote that even if someone was searching for him, they would never think to look there. The town was quiet, the kind of place where people kept to themselves and asked few questions, a perfect fit for Richard, who had no interest in forming new relationships or becoming part of the community. He found work as a handyman, fixing up old houses that dotted the town. The physical labor kept him busy, and the solitude suited him. On the surface, it was the perfect escape, but beneath that surface, the turmoil of his actions churned like a storm. The nights were the worst when the sun set and the town slipped into silence. Richard was left alone with his thoughts, the images of that fateful night replaying in his mind. He would see Sandra's face, the shock in her eyes as she realized what was happening. He could hear the deafening crack of the gunshots, a sound that echoed in his ears, a sound he couldn't escape even in the deepest sleep. Richard would lie awake, staring at the ceiling of his small, sparsely furnished room, the guilt gnawing at him like a relentless predator. The satisfaction he had felt in the moments after the killings had long since faded, replaced by a hollow emptiness that seemed to grow with each passing day. He had gotten his revenge, but at what cost? He had destroyed not just Sandra's life, but his own. The woman he had once loved, the life they had built together, all of it was gone, reduced to ashes in a fit of rage that now seemed almost senseless. During the daylight hours, Richard tried to push these thoughts aside, burying himself in work, but the memories were always there, lurking just beneath the surface, ready to pounce the moment he let his guard down. Sometimes, as he walked through the town or worked on someone's home, he would catch himself thinking about the life he had left behind, the daughters he would never see again, the friends who would never know what had truly happened to him. He had escaped the law, but he hadn't escaped himself. There were moments when Richard wondered if he could ever truly atone for what he had done. He had fled to avoid the consequences, but the real punishment was the one he carried within himself, the knowledge that he had become a murderer, that he had allowed his anger and pain to drive him to such a dark place. This burden was one that no amount of distance could lighten. As the weeks turned into months, Richard settled into the routine of his new life, but the guilt never lessened. It was always there, a constant reminder of the price he had paid for his revenge. He had lost everything: his family, his home, his sense of self, and in the end, he knew that this was his true punishment. He could hide from the world, but he could never hide from the man he had become.